Extraordinary. Thank you, Rodney Eatman, for leading us into our Wednesday at Westmont this week. I'm Reverend Dr. Rene Whitaker, and up in our tech center, Kevin Howell always keeps us online. We're glad that Rodney came to share music with us this afternoon. To make a couple of announcements before I introduce our guest. Just know on Sunday we will continue to live stream. We'll be at the fourth Sunday of Advent, and our preparations to receive Emmanuel into our lives again will continue. Christmas Eve will be different. This year, anybody in the community is invited to come to our 7 o'clock service, which will be outside in our garth, and we will have mostly carols and candles and probably a short word. We hope to have it well lit and have it sparkly so that we all can celebrate in this unusual year. And then for those who can't come outside, we will be live streaming Christmas Eve at 10 p.m. And then that will be on YouTube to share whether you watch it that evening or share it on Christmas Day or sometime through Holy Week. And also, we said we weren't going to do next Wednesday at Westmont, but instead we decided we're going to socially distance a few of our children and bring a special bit of Christmas music to all of you who can tune in to see that. With that, I just want to read a short reading from Kneeling in Bethlehem by Anne Weems in celebration of this third week of Advent. I wonder if God comes to the edge of heaven each Advent and flings the star into the December sky, laughing with joy as it lights the darkness of the earth, and the angels, hearing the laughter of God, begin to congregate in some celestial chamber to practice their alleluias. I wonder if there's some ordering of rank among the angels as they move into procession. The seraphim bumping the cherubim from the top spot. The new inhabitants of heaven standing in the back until they get the knack of it. After all, treading air over a stable and enunciating at the same time can't be all that easy. Or is it that everybody, that is, every soul, free to fly wherever the Spirit moves? Or do they even think about it? Perhaps when God calls, perhaps they just come, this multitude of heavenly hosts, winging through the winds of time, full of expectancy, full of hope, that this year, perhaps the earth will fall to its knees in a whisper of peace. And so on this day, may God's peace, which passes all understanding, be with us as we share this time together. And now, I would like to introduce Richard Burkert. He wanted to say it's not a real Christmas program, but yet it is very relevant to the world in which we live, for people who came from other places and shared their lives passing through this community and living with one another. Richard from Jaha.
Yeah, well, I'm pleased to be here. When Reverend Whitaker invited me to come, she suggested I might speak about Christmas, and I don't have any good Christmas stories from Johnstown's history particularly, but they're quite, it's an interesting place historically, so I suggested immigrants. And I don't know how seasonal that is, but Johnstown's got a great story like many communities. Why we had so many of the new immigrants was because we had coal mines and steel mills here. When Johnstown in the 1850s was becoming an industrial center, they attracted trained iron makers here, but Cambria Iron Company's innovation was to automate steel making, and they were able to bring in farm boys and, some of the immigrants at that time, the Germans, other groups, bring them and turn them into iron and later steel workers. But as time went by, the whole entire steel industry automated, and they producing just huge amounts of metal here in Johnstown and other steel centers. And the jobs got simpler and simpler, de-skilled and automated. So you needed unskilled labor, and they couldn't attract enough of them, so they started hiring. These immigrants started showing up from East Central Europe and Southern Europe, the Slavs, the Italians, Greeks, whole groups that were coming to the United States to try to improve their lives, to raise money so they could get ahead in the old country. It's in that context that we started seeing in the 1880s immigrants from what is now Slovakia and other Slavic countries could come here to get jobs in the mills. Earlier, though, coming to the United States wasn't, it's part of a worldwide phenomena. In the Eastern European countries, the Industrial Revolution hadn't hit there as strongly as in Western Europe, France, Germany, even Italy. And so these Slavic peasants basically would seasonally go into Western Europe, help pick crops or in the winter work in factories. And so coming to America just seemed like a natural extension for them. They could come here and make some money, go back, get married, maybe buy some land, really get ahead. There was no way to accumulate capital in the old country. In the 19th century, those Eastern European countries had seen a population explosion. Basically, that region had doubled their population in the 19th century. So, land was really expensive, and there was no other way to get ahead. So the idea was to come to America, North America, or even South America, find work, do whatever it took to get, amass some capital and get ahead. So their intentions were not always to stay here. We tend to view coming to America as, a great opportunity and, a decision that was, once made was never revisited. And it turns out that nearly all of them, except for the Jews, who were like fleeing persecution, all these peasants in this whole swath of area in East Central Europe, their goal was really just to make money and go back home. Fully a third of them did, which is something that few people recognize, back migration, that people either fulfilled their goals, they got enough money that they could lead a better life, or they failed and somehow got back home and lived out their lives in Europe. Once they got here, they had distinct goals. They didn't just come here because life was better in America. And for them, it was very difficult. They were here to get ahead. They wanted to amass money in order to have a better life in the old country. The good life, what did that mean? That meant owning a home, it's having better food. Once they got here, it meant wearing American clothes, not looking like a peasant, somebody off the farm. They're having better furnishings, and then later participation in one's church, and they built over the course of the first and then second generation a rich network of cultural institutions. These people were pretty much excluded from the dominant culture and society here in America and lived in their own neighborhoods that were popularly referred to as the foreign colonies. And most Johnstown residents didn't know very much about what went on in these areas. And you'd have reports from the foreign colonies about people being arrested, or, it was kind of, there were no real opportunities to get to know one another. As time went by, 25% of Johnstown was, by the 1920s, Slavic foreigners here. But they're, until the second generation, when you had, competitive baseball sports first, and then finally the Second World War is what really broke down the barriers. But initially, there were two separate societies here. They needed these newcomers' labor to drive the mills and do the work, but they didn't really want to, mix. And so they were really like two separate societies. These foreign colonies in Johnstown were primarily Cambria City was by far the biggest of them, but also Woodville and Franklin and Minersville. These are all foreign colonies. And again, this is like late 19th century, early 20th century, really up to the Second World War. Now, how did they get ahead? The men that went in the mills and mines were rigorously exploited. They were paid very little. This was a dangerous occupation. You have incidents like the rolling mill mine explosion in 1902, where 112 male miners, mostly foreign, were killed in a mine right below where we're standing here in the Westmont Presbyterian Church. On the hillside by the inclined plane, there was an opening, went back 7 miles to the oldest coal mine associated with the Cambria and then Bethlehem Steel, and killed 125 miners. Over 40 of them were Polish. And they were, actually recruited to go into the mines by their priest, who, was a labor broker. Basically, he had a really sweet arrangement with the Cambria Company. He would find Polish workers for the steel company, and at pay time, the company would deduct their tithe, their 10% from their income from their pay, and remit it to the church. So, again, once you started seeing labor organizations in Johnstown, that priest wasn't terribly popular. In fact, they literally, 1919, dynamited his front porch off of the rectory, just, because there were some long-term bad feelings there. At any rate, again, I'm digressing here a little bit. How they got ahead, they couldn't do it just on the wages of a single male head of household. It was a way to make money, but it really took the entire family to amass enough money to get ahead. So they used the family economy. And this, again, lasted till after World War II. If you had boys, they dropped out of school in the 8th grade, 12 years old, and went to work, opening mine doors in the mines or as helpers in the mill. And you worked alongside your father or your uncle. And, in some ways it was an apprenticeship program, but, who wants children in the steel mills at age 12? And you contributed your earnings to the family economy. Women in the first generation particularly kept house. They took in boarders. And that's, a lot of these first immigrants were male. They came over to make money and go back. Well, then they sometimes would send money or even go back themselves and bring a wife, and they'd start a family here. But then the wife was drafted into the family economy. And, again, all these new men coming over from Europe, they didn't, they either... there were some like immigrant hotels, but generally what they did was, board in somebody's house. And so you had multiple boarders, and the wife would have to wash their clothes, prepare their food, pack their lunches. And girls in the family would help with this. So it was really, make money any way possible. Men in the early years up to the 20s worked 12-hour shifts. I think it's arguable that the women's shift was basically never done. And so it was a lot of just unrelenting hard work. They were able to get ahead. There's some of this, I think, is really terribly interesting. Some of the odd insights you get from this. People they use, this phrase actually came up more recently in the last couple of years, chain networks. How did they get here? How did they get from this village in Slovakia or this village in Slovenia? How did they get here to Johnstown? Well, they used chain networks. Some pioneer went first and got established here. He was a family member, or they lived in the same village, and he would send letters back to the old country and saying, I'm doing pretty good here. I'm making money. And these letters are hysterical because, again, their view of what the good life was is probably different. And it involved a lot of hard, dangerous work. But again, they were eating different. In the old country, you ate very little protein. Maybe a chicken at Easter or something. And in the new country, this was a wide availability of meat. And so you see these references to what they ate. In America, we eat meat 3 meals a day, and it's fat meat. So it's like, this is a wondrous place. Another thing that I think attracted people to the United States was immigrants, when they had been here long enough to be a little bit established, they didn't want to look like greenhorns. They didn't want to be, newcomers. And so they would men would buy a used suit from Glosser Brothers. That's where they did I'll get to the Jews here in a little bit. It's another very different but very, very interesting story. They literally sold used suits. They were tailors originally. And then you could go out and buy a gold-plated pocket watch. And then we just have hundreds of these images of the immigrant generation, a studio portrait of them standing in their new used seat with a watch fob and chain. And, they'd send us back to the old country and, look at Frank. He is a prosperous American. And so that, again, once this started, everybody wanted to come to the United States to make money, and you really did empty out a lot of areas. And that was really based on this concept of chain. Someone you knew from the old country went first and then attracted others here. I think probably one of the things that is most profound, and these were peasants. These were agricultural workers. They followed the rhythm of the seasons and the light. And they came to Johnstown and became industrial workers, went in below ground or into a mill, and they punched in. They had a time clock, and they began to work on industrial time. This was a totally foreign thing to them, and they did it. They adjusted, and they did it to to get ahead, to make sure their family didn't go under, which was a persistent fear that your family wouldn't make it. You simply wouldn't make it and disappear. As time went by, they had kind of generic institutions. There were a couple churches down there. The German Catholic Church, St. Mary's Immaculate Conception, the Slovaks started going there, and then they built their own church, and then it was sort of the mother church for other nationality groups down there, other ethnic groups. And by the 1920s, what you had is this really rich network of cultural institutions. They rebuilt their lives here in America. and they built, ethnic churches. They built, again, the clubs, the third place where, clubs were really critical. A lot of these started out as insurance societies. Life was, dangerous and insecure, and so you would, they'd start these burial insurance or death benefit insurance societies. These would get a headquarters, and then this is where you lived your social life. This is where when you christened your baby, or your daughter got married, or there was baptism. This is where you celebrated. So places like, Cambridge City by the 1920s were really, 10,000 people living in that neighborhood, where there's about 500 today. So you had these, between church and clubs and all, the saloons, you had really a rich network to support a whole way of life down there. You never had enough, any single ethnic group to form its own neighborhood, like you saw in Pittsburgh, like Polish Hill, or some of the other ethnic neighborhoods. And so there was some intermixing. Now, when immigrants came to the United States, they didn't think of themselves. They didn't have national identities. We think of them as being Polish or Slovak or Serbian or Croatian. When most of them came here, they had local or at best regional identities. A lot of these countries didn't even exist back then. A lot of these people came from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, places that were broken up after World War I. And so coming to America, they got here and they found that, well, there were some people that used the same language, that had similar customs, and so they began gradually to think of themselves in terms of not just being from this region, this area, but began to think of themselves as Polish or Slovak or Serbian. And had, again, these different ethnic groups, that's how they were hired in the mill, because they could speak the same language. It was a good way to keep down, union organization. If you keep them all speaking, separate and, same language ethnic groups. But this is, so they began to think of themselves as being national. I built, the Polish Catholic Church, and as time, those identities became more crystallized. They really, for the first time, began to think of themselves as being Polish, and in time that they became, Polish American. They fused American customs and traits with some of their old country traits, and so they kind of became Americans on their own terms, and really, expanded what it meant to be Americans. And so, in time, they could be proud of their ancestry, but again, they did it kind of on their own terms. After World War I, there was for people who were thinking about going back, a lot of places there wasn't much to go back to, particularly after World War II. But again, they had a really strong community to support them. What really broke this all down was World War II. When you get called up and go through basic training, and then, after World War II, the GI Bill offered our opportunity to get out of mill work, to get an education, start going into the professions. Going into politics was new for these people as well. But it was really World War II that changed everything and broke down the divisions that separated people in Johnstown. And really brought these people into the mainstream. They started moving up on the hill into some of the outlying, Westwood, some of these things. Everybody wanted to live the good life, and this is what it meant in Johnstown. Jews were very different. They were fleeing persecution, but they lived in these same areas. Typically, the Slavs weren't traders. In fact, they thought, many of them felt they were prohibited from like money changers, that kind of thing. And so the Jews had skills like, jewelry and watchmaking, that kind of thing. But they also had traders. They lived in shtetls, these little villages throughout the country. In the same areas where these Slavs lived, they typically spoke multiple languages. They came to Johnstown. They started, their niche was not gone. They didn't go into mills. They started selling to the people they knew, the same type of people, the Slavs. And Jews would, earlier, there's a Yiddish term that I forget, but you get kind of a grub stake, a loan from someone in your community, and you go out and start peddling, with wagons. You start peddling to the coal mine towns. You get enough money, you rent a storefront in Johnstown. At any time by the 20s and 30s, a large portion of the businesses in downtown Johnstown were Jewish owned. They were so prosperous that, elsewhere Jews, the second generation, they tended to go into, they valued learning and they went into the professions. In Johnstown, they just kept running the stores here because they were doing so well. I think probably the classic Jewish business, though, was the Gloucester's department store, long lamented, but it really catered to the workers. They called themselves, their nickname was a working man's friend. They would give workers credit. And Nathan Gloucester came over with his father, but he was a tailor. He started selling, again, used suits and trunks, so you could send goods back to the old country. Expanded there with his sons, and really became a institution here in Johnstown. A lot of the second generation children of immigrants got jobs at Gloucester's and really learned something really new, how to be clerks, how to do bookkeeping. They refer to Gloucester's as Gloucester's Jew, because you would really get an education there as well. Of course, the one big difference, was that the Jews never thought about going back, which is good. Many of the towns, villages they came from didn't exist after Second World War. What happened to all this? In the teens, you start seeing the Dillingham Commission, congressionally authorized commission looking at the plight of industrial workers. It was bad. They were exploited. And their conclusion was that the only way to stop them from being exploited was to cut off immigration. And there were lots of other people, and this was a progressive effort. There were lots of other people in Congress and in politics at that time who didn't like them, period, so they were happy to see the wave of immigrants cut off, which happened really functionally during World War I with the war effort. But then in the early 20s, they really cut this off, and the mills still needed employment. Where did they look? They went down south, first like Baltimore, Washington. But Charles Price was the general manager of the steel mill. His chauffeur went down to Alabama to start recruiting Southern black families who were bringing them up here to get, again, the same types of jobs in the mills. If anything, they suffered even more discrimination. I think, though, this is all an amazing story. We do an exhibit at the Heritage Discovery Center, America Through Immigrant Eyes, which actually puts you in the place of being an immigrant to Johnstown. But I think what's good to reflect about is that, America is really a country of immigrants. The Latinos and Hispanics that are coming today, the patterns are virtually identical to these people that were discriminated against and they're viewed as a necessary evil. Now as the generation has passed, they've been embraced by the community. And what's interesting is you can almost choose your ethnic, that's a, kind of a sense of the 70s. You can decide what you want to be in America if you want to honor your ethnicity. And so, again, this is part of who we are, and thanks for the opportunity to tell that story.
Thank you, Richard. And of course, basically, all of our Christmas traditions came from people from different places who brought their traditions, and we continue to share them throughout the season, most of the time without knowing where they originated and how they came to be the way they are today. So with that, we thank Richard Burkert for being with us. Thank all of you for being with us out there. And may our journey to the stable continue, and everybody stay safe, and hope to see you on Sunday and next week, or hope you see us on Sunday and next week. Thanks, bye, and Rodney will lead us out with some other beautiful music.